All right. Looks like we have folks gathering us here as participants. I can see the list filling up here, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon for our presentation, How Your Bylaw Provisions Impact Your Bottom Line. My name is Mark Petrie. I'll be facilitating this webinar for us today, and I'm the Marketing Director here at Makower, Abbate, Guerra, Wegner, Vollmer. Also, I'd like to provide a brief introduction to both of our speakers today. We have attorney Evan Alexander, and he's been with our firm since 2015, as well as one of our firm's partners, Jeff Vollmer, presenting for us today. I'll just advance the slide so you can see them here. There they are. And both Evan and Jeff specialize in community association law, assisting the firm's clients with assessment, collection, restriction enforcement, governing document amendments, and more. Now I'd just like to move on to a couple of housekeeping items so you know how you can interact with us today during the presentation. As we go along, we will have everyone muted at the start here, but if you have questions for Evan or Jeff during the presentation, feel free to type your questions in the chat. You should be able to see the chat button at the bottom of your screen there, which will open the chat window. I can keep an eye on that as we go along, and I'll try to find a good moment to jump in with your question. Alternatively, you can wait till the end of the presentation, at which point we can open up for a live conversation with you. Of course, please be aware that the answers to your questions may depend on your particular governing documents, and we cannot provide legal advice for you today, which brings us to our next slide. This presentation provides general information and is not legal advice and should not be used or taken as legal advice for specific situations. You should consult legal counsel before taking any action or making any decisions concerning the matters in this presentation. This communication does not create an attorney-client relationship between Makower, Abbate, Guerra, Wegner, Vollmer, PLLC, and the recipient. So great. Finally, we would like to get to know you a little bit here. So we have just a couple of poll questions that will help us understand where you're coming from. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll right now. So on your screen there, you should be able to see this, which best describes your role within your community association or associations. If you could just choose the one best answer for you there. Are you a manager? Are you a board member, developer, individual owner, resident, or does something else describe you best? Okay, great. You have some answers coming in there. And the second question, which of the following best describes the type of community you live in? Are you a stacked condominium, townhouse condominium, site condominium, subdivision, HOA, cooperative, or some other type of development? Terrific. I'll just give a few more seconds for responses there. Great. So it looks like we have roughly a quarter of people are managers, about 68% board members. Let's see, we have a few individual owners and residents with us as well today. And we have a lot of condominium owners, a few stacked condominiums. We have 24% townhouse condominiums, 32% site condominiums, 34% subdivisions, HOAs, and a few others. There we go. I can share the results right on the screen there for you to take a look at too. Thank you so much. That really helps us understand our audience today. Thank you very much. All right, so we appreciate that. We are now ready to begin. And I will advance to the first slide in our presentation and turn it over to Evan and Jeff.
Thank you, Mark. So as Mark was explaining, the focus of today's presentation is really about your governing documents and the provisions in your governing documents that really affect your overall budget and, of course, the assessment responsibilities. So one of the primary areas in any set of governing documents that has a direct impact on your budget and in line with your assessment rates is the regular day-to-day responsibilities for the common elements, the other items within your communities. As might make very clear sense to everyone, the more that the association is responsible for, the more has to be included in the budget to cover those expenses. So if you've got typical older, especially condominium documents, the association is going to be assigned responsibility for most, if not all, of the general and the limited common elements, which means that the association and your board have to budget for those future maintenance, repair, and replacement expenses. Something that can be done now to help reduce that overall budget amount and help control assessment levels is to amend your documents to shift some of those responsibilities. By adding responsibilities or shifting them to the individual owners, you reduce the association's responsibilities and reduce the amount that has to be factored into the budget. Of course, in most markets, and whenever someone is looking to purchase a home, especially in a community association, one of the primary things that they're looking at is the current assessment level and the frequency or likelihood of additional assessments. Those, of course, are directly impacted by the amount that the association has to budget and the types of items or the extent of the association's responsibilities for those common elements. By shifting some of those responsibilities back to the owners, you can help control the assessment rates and the budget levels, and that factors into the overall real estate prices and resale prices that you and your fellow owners will see when they go to sell their properties. When we're talking about condominiums specifically, you're going to be looking to the master deed, typically in Article 4, which identifies and describes all of the common elements, both limited and general. A caution here is that just because an item is identified as a general common element or a limited common element, that does not necessarily align with or determine the responsibility for that item. Something can be described as a limited common element and it can be an association responsibility, or vice versa, it can be a general common element that is assigned to individual co-owners as an individual responsibility. So when you're considering whether to shift any of those responsibilities over to the owners, know that you can do that through an amendment. It does require the approval of 2/3 of all eligible owners. What you cannot do, though, is change the descriptions or the definitions of the common elements. That requires 100% approval of all owners. Note also that when you are shifting responsibilities in the condominium context to the co-owners, so a shift in responsibility from the association to the individual co-owners, the Condominium Act requires a mortgagee vote, which is effectively a 90-day waiting period where the banks that hold any first mortgage on a unit in the community are entitled to vote. The reality is they simply don't, which is why I refer to it as effectively a 90-day waiting period.
Hey, Evan, one practice point that I want to jump in on too with respect to this issue. I think a critical component of this is making sure that you as a board or a manager understand what the association and co-owner responsibilities are to begin with. And so often we find that just somebody made the decision 20 years ago and that window should be a co-owner responsibility, but never consulted the governing documents, right? And or the developer created a responsibility matrix at the outset of the community that was just flat wrong. So, part of, considering whether to shift responsibilities is understanding what do the governing documents say with respect to responsibilities to begin with.
That's a great point, Jeff. And just kind of following up on that, I know working with our association clients, doing amendment projects, oftentimes I'll point out, here is what the current responsibilities are. Do you want to make any changes? And the response we'll receive from the board is, well, we've been doing it that way the whole time. Yes, we want to make that change. So it's a very valid point, and we often see responsibilities being done not quite in line with what the current governing documents reflect. So speaking to condominiums and what sort of responsibilities you as a board or your association might want to shift to the co-owners. I'll say it first generally. Typically, we're talking about items that all units have, but are not really structural and don't really necessarily affect other units or the common elements. Things like windows, entry doors and garage doors, garage floor slabs, if your condominium has garages at all. Similarly, driveways. Again, not all condos have driveways, but that is something that can be shifted, as well as porches, patios, decks, and balconies. Now, those are all items where typically either all units have each of them or all units have some combination of them. When I talk about combinations, I'm talking to porches, patios, decks, and balconies, because oftentimes a first story unit will have a patio, whereas the second floor unit will have a balcony. But those are some examples of things that we see our association clients choosing to shift to co-owners. Something I meant to mention in the last slide, when you're talking about the relative responsibilities, it's important to remember there is only one source of funding for your association. So regardless of whether it is an association responsibility item or the individual owner responsibility item, the underlying cost for that is being paid by the individual co-owners. It's just a matter of whether that co-owner gets to budget on their own, select and hire their own contractor and pay that contractor directly, or whether that series of tasks is all within the board's discretion. Another thing to note is even when an item is assigned to the co-owners, the board and the association still maintain architectural control. So just because you, for example, assign unit entry doors or windows to the individual owner, that doesn't mean that those individual owners can replace them with whatever color, style, make, model, whatever door or window they choose. It must either match the existing or be approved by the board of directors. When it comes to subdivisions and site condos, the responsibilities are, of course, a little bit different. Typically in both subdivisions and in site condominiums, the owners are responsible for the dwelling or the residence and all other improvements that are located within their lot or their unit. Now, something that we often see done improperly or misinterpreted in governing documents is the responsibility for the area between the sidewalk and the actual paved surface of your streets. It's a little bit technical, but if you look at a condominium subdivision plan for a site condominium, a careful review will show you that the actual road is wider than the paved surface and typically goes to the outer edges of the sidewalks. That means that those sidewalks and everything towards the street from those sidewalks is actually located outside of the lot or the unit and is often assigned as an association responsibility because it's not specifically assigned to the individual owners. That's an area that we often see mistaken and misunderstood by association clients, where the association will be mandating owners take responsibility for items within that area. And then eventually when it comes to a legal review or a need for legal action, we have to be the bearer of unfortunate news that that's actually an association responsibility and it's been handled wrong for years. Other things that if your documents don't already assign them to the owners are roofs and landscaping. Again, these are all things that can be assigned to co-owners to help reduce the overall association budget, thereby protecting the assessment levels, which have a direct impact on unit sales or home sales. Another note here, and this specifically relates to condominiums and windows. Older documents will often differentiate the responsibility between the actual glass of a window and the window frame and other components. The reality is, if you go to Home Depot or Lowe's or your local hardware store and you order a new window, you don't buy just the glass or just the frame. They typically come as one whole unit, and that's how you can purchase them. So by having that distinction and responsibility between glass and frames, it makes it a practical difficulty for who does the ordering, who replaces this item, when we know that the actual cost and the responsibility is split between the association and the individual owners. When we see that in governing documents and we're working with associations on an amendment, we recommend, even if they want to keep it as an association responsibility or keep it as a co-owner responsibility, just assigning that the full item. So windows, including the glass, frames, hardware, screens, etc., all of that to either the association or to the co-owner.
You know what, Evan, we have a hand up here from Craig. He might not be able to type in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and make your mic live here, Craig. And do you want to unmute yours? There you are.
Yes.
Hi, Craig.
Hi. Yes, I had two questions that kind of go along this way, but can I ask them to clarify the comment about the sidewalks to the streets? Did they say it included the sidewalk to the street, or it began below the sidewalk to the street?
More often than not, and Jeff, correct me if you disagree with that percentage approximation, more often than not, it includes the sidewalk all the way to the outer edge of the sidewalk on the other side of the street. Now,
Okay.
I say that typically there certainly are governing documents where the original drafter knew about and was aware of that issue and drafted accordingly. So it is quite possible that a set of governing documents do actually specifically address that area and the responsibility for it.
Okay.
Though in older documents, we often see it overlooked and just left unclear, which means that it falls upon the association.
Okay.
Yeah.
My two questions, I just wanted to, if you find a better place to answer them later on, my association manager is also on. I've got a meeting another meeting I have to go to, but the two questions, if you could address sometime during the presentation, what are the most common items that come up, most difficult common items that come up in associations dealing with changing their bylaws? If, you know, and now we're site condos, but I guess maybe in general you want to answer that, but there's got to be a handful of those difficult ones. And then the other thing, can you actually put some months or years with the timeline? I know in some of the information we've seen, it actually, you go over what has to be covered, but I would like to get your feel that in general, the timeline to go ahead and redo bylaws until it's ultimately completed. So that's my two questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig.
Want to jump in and
Yeah, absolutely. So I every community is unique. Okay. And just when I think that I've got it figured out, that I know what it will be difficult to pass and what won't be difficult to pass, I am confused at a meeting based upon the feedback that we get from individual members. And so I think it's really hard to kind of pigeonhole the idea of what are the extremely difficult amendments to pass versus what aren't, because it really is so unique to each community. And maybe this is, again, giving a lot of practice pointers here. This is, I think, an important aspect of doing any amendment process. Does the board have the trust of the community? Okay, because if the community trusts the board and the community knows that the board is in support of the amendments and will be subject to the amendments, obviously, as owners, then it's easier to convince the residents that these amendments are in their best interest. Okay, so I think that's to start. I'm reluctant to kind of point out specific examples of what is difficult and what isn't, because it varies. As it relates to timing, I think realistically, we're talking, 9 to 12 months all in, okay? And that may vary a little bit based upon whether you need to get mortgagee consent, as Evan alluded to a specific amendment under the Condo Act that requires it, because that by itself takes a couple of weeks to prepare the ballots. There's a 90-day waiting period. So tacking that on to everything that you've already done, we're definitely at it, probably at a year for a comprehensive amendment project. If we're doing something at a smaller scale, it will take a little bit less time.
Good, thank you.
Yep.
And that actually works as a perfect segue into the next topic, which is garnering support for your amendment. And one of the points that Jeff just made, and this is not exactly here, but it goes to the last point I'm going to comment on. I'll call it communication. Explaining to the owners what the issue is, why the proposed amendment is beneficial in addressing that issue, and really grouping yourselves as board members together with the owners, because you are. All of the members are equal as members. The board does have some additional authorities under the governing documents or under the Condominium Act or Nonprofit Corporation Act, but really you're all members, you're all assessed in the same way. You all have to pay those assessments, and you all have to live under the responsibilities that are identified in your governing documents. So with that, one option for helping to garner that support and get the approval is to make it somewhat fair, and that goes to including a potential one-time replacement. For example, I'll use garage doors. I was working with a community not long ago where a good portion, somewhere in the neighborhood of half of the garage doors, had been replaced in the last 3 years. Well, they wanted to transfer that responsibility to the owners, but it wasn't fair to those owners who hadn't had their doors replaced to have paid into the replacement for the other half. So we factored into that amendment a one-time replacement, where if you had not had your door replaced since the prior round of replacements, you would be entitled to one replacement after the amendment became effective. Now, we can get into a little bit more detail there by tailoring that language so that if a unit is sold, for example, that one-time replacement goes away. The whole idea is to benefit the owners who have been paying into the fund and not future owners who never paid into those funds at all. Another option, and this kind of really is more tailored to condominiums, but theoretically could apply in some subdivision contexts as well, is the idea of transferring the responsibility for cost, but not performance. So the association would still handle the hiring of the contractor, the timing of the project, doing the work, but the individual owners are responsible for the cost of that. We see this sometimes with structural elements, something like a skylight, where the replacement of skylight is an integral part of the roof structure. If it's done improperly, it can damage the roof structure, walls, cause water leaks, and just lead to a whole handful of other problems. So by keeping that within the association's purview for performing the work, but charging that cost back to the benefited owner, you can help to protect all of those common elements I just referenced, but also more equally assign the expenses. And then skylights is a great example because we often see associations where not all homes have skylights, or not all homes have the same number of skylights. And so by charging just the owner whose skylight is being replaced, it's really equalizing it and making it more fair to all of those other owners who don't actually have skylights. And skylights is just one example, but I thought was a good example for this context.
Yeah, one other example, Evan, that I might throw out there is like a cantilevered balcony, right? So if you have a cantilevered balcony where the joists are extending essentially beneath the floor construction, well, we have like a limited common element and a general common element kind of meshing together. And so do we really want co-owners kind of delving into that aspect of balcony repairs or replacements? Maybe not. So it's easier for the association to kind of be the coordinator of the work and then charge those costs back to the individual co-owner.
Yeah, that's a great example, Jeff. Thank you. So this last bullet point here really goes to kind of the intro that I was talking about, communicating. Provide the raw numbers for anticipated expenses for a project and what that would turn into as far as assessments per unit, per owner. You can also use other actual numbers, things like reserve studies, your current expenses related to a certain item and anticipated future expenses. You can also, oftentimes you'll have contractor estimates for replacements of these items. So you can give owners a realistic idea of what that shift in responsibility will mean, not only to them individually for their own budgeting, but also how it will directly affect the association's budget and help to protect those future assessment levels.
And one other kind of strategic point as it relates to amendments, and I'm very upfront with, boards that I meet with who are considering the amendment projects, and that is, you may be the most well-intentioned board in the world and believe that these amendments are in the best interest of the community, which they should be, but you still, that by itself aren't going to get people to come out and vote for these amendments, okay? Inevitably, there is some aspect, most likely, of politicking that you'll need to undertake in order to get amendments approved by knocking on doors, placing phone calls, and emailing co-owners who don't respond to the kind of the initial balloting process. So my recommendation is be prepared for that. And if you don't want to take that on, it could make it that much more challenging to get amendments across the goal line.
Yeah, and to kind of add to that or say it in a slightly different way, I know in my experience, the primary reason we ever see amendments fail is not because of dissenting opinions or no votes. It's because of apathy, and your neighbors just don't vote. And I'll get to it in a few minutes, I believe. But in the condominium context, especially, an owner must affirmatively vote yes to have their support for an amendment. Anything other than a submitted ballot with a yes vote counts as a no. So it is really incumbent upon a board to make that extra effort and communicate with your neighbors and encourage them to vote. And oftentimes that means a follow-up campaign with, actual door-to-door, approaches to other owners and your neighbors to get them to vote. So one of the other types of responsibilities that is addressed in governing documents is your insurance. Oftentimes, especially in older documents, the insurance responsibilities, often or typically contained in Article 4 of your bylaws, don't directly align with the day-to-day responsibilities that we were just talking about in Article 4 of your master deed. So especially in older documents, although it's true with some new documents today, you will see the association responsible to carry what we refer to as single entity coverage. It's basically an all-in insurance coverage where the association is responsible for not only the structure, but also interior items like fixtures, equipment, trim, builder grade items. And even sometimes the language will provide that the association is responsible for betterments and improvements to those items. So one thing to look at, and something that you can do, is work with your insurance broker to make sure that the coverage your association is carrying is actually aligned with what your documents require you to carry. But once you've done that, once you know that you're carrying the right coverage, or you've looked at your documents and spoken with counsel about exactly what your responsibilities are, is to consider revising those responsibilities and placing some additional onto the co-owners or your individual co-owners. The shift that we are seeing commonly these days, and really often recommending to our clients, is to require co-owners to ensure the interior of your units, including personal property, but also including the fixtures, equipment, and trim. Part of the reason for this recommended shift in coverage is that most owners, especially anyone who has a mortgage on their unit, is likely already carrying this insurance coverage. It's often or typically referred to as an HO6 insurance policy, which is the typical homeowner's insurance for a condominium unit. if you as an owner, or if your neighbors as owners are carrying that HO6 policy, they've likely already got coverage for their fixtures, equipment, and trim and other items within their unit. By shifting the responsibility, removing that single entity coverage from the association and placing it on the owners, you avoid double covering those items. Again, remembering there's only one source of funding, so why pay for something twice? It also helps to reduce the frequency or extent of claims that fall on the association's insurance policy. And while it's always been a concern to avoid significant amounts of claims on association policies, it is even more important nowadays. Historically, there were plenty of insurance companies that were marketing and trying to provide master policies to condominiums and homeowners associations. In today's market, that number is dwindling. And in fact, I've heard rumblings that some of the current carriers are trying to get out of the market and aren't issuing as many new master policies to associations. So with that, and with the understanding that a negative loss history can and often does result in cancellation or significantly increased insurance premiums for the association, reducing those claims, assigning more to the co-owners, it's really beneficial for the association, the budget, and all of your individual owners to protect everybody's bottom line.
Yeah, Evan, maybe it might be helpful if I can, provide an illustration of how a single entity policy would work in the event of a loss. And
Absolutely.
so let's say that there was a fire that damaged, a building of, let's say, 4 units, right? Okay, burned to the ground. So the association's policy is going to be primary, and obviously it's going to rebuild the roof, the trusses, the perimeter walls, et cetera, right? Okay, but it's not only doing that, it's actually paying to rebuild, cabinetry, vanities, most appliances, and trim inside the unit, so that the association's policy is not only putting back the structure, but paying for those interior improvements up to what's generally known as, builder's grade. So what the builder or the developer provided as kind of the base level items, i.e. Formica, not, quartz or granite, okay? That's what the association's policy is paying for. So it doesn't stop at the 4 walls, it continues inward to cover those types of fixtures, equipment, and trim.
Great extra clarification there, Jeff. So we're talking about amending documents and some changes you want to make. What, in the context of condominiums, does it take to amend your documents? Well, if it's a material change, which is any change that really affects the day-to-day rights and responsibilities of the owners or of the association, then it's going to require 2/3 of all co-owners that are entitled to vote. That's under the Condominium Act. So in the unlikely event that your condo documents provide for some other approval requirement, whether it's a 50% or a 90% or whatever other percentage might be stated, just know that under the act, it is 2/3 of all owners entitled to vote. Now, entitled to vote means that it does not include those who have suspended voting rights. Most typically, that is only going to apply to owners who are delinquent in their payments to the association. Occasionally, newer documents and documents that we've rewritten more recently will include a definition for good standing and will revoke a person's right to vote if they are in violation of a provision of the governing documents. But older documents is really going to relate to assessment delinquencies rather than violation of other provisions. Then, as I mentioned a moment ago, in the condominium context especially, the owners must vote in the affirmative in order for it to count as a yes vote. A non-response or anything other than an actual yes vote is counted as and considered a no vote. That's not true for forced mortgage companies, though. When an amendment requires a mortgagee vote, they're given 90 days to vote. And under the act, if they don't vote, which is the vast majority of the time, it automatically counts as a yes vote. That was something that was amended in the Condominium Act in the early 2000s. And I believe that it was done because the reality is the mortgage companies simply don't vote. And if it required mortgagee approval under the same requirements as co-owner approval, amendments would never get passed. I note that those two items that I just spoke about were really targeted towards condominiums. Subdivisions, you really need to just look at your own declaration to see what the amendment provisions provide. Typically, it's going to be right near the end of your declaration. We see anything from 51% approval all the way up to 90% approval. And oftentimes that amendment approval requirement in a declaration is going to be based upon how long since that declaration was originally recorded. Many times it'll say within the first 20 years, it requires a 90% vote. Then it automatically renews for successive 10-year periods. And during those periods, then it can be amended with a 75% vote of the owners. Another, probably too detailed to get into right now, consideration for subdivisions specifically is when your declaration contains automatic renewal language, it may not be possible for you to amend your declaration during one of those terms. That's a technical issue, and it really depends heavily on the language in your declaration. So if you've got questions about amending a subdivisions declaration, we would certainly encourage you to contact our office and speak with one of the attorneys to see about what your amendment approval requirements are.
There is no rhyme or reason to the standard for amending subdivision restrictions. It is a hodgepodge of many differing drafters that came up with their own language.
Yeah, they didn't have a nice condominium act to rely upon, so they all just got to free form it and look at whatever they could find and make stuff up along the way. All right, so another area of your governing documents that can really cost an association a lot of money are the negligence and incidental damage provisions. Speaking to negligence first, often it's going to be contained in Article 6, which section is variable depending on the drafter of your documents. However, what the negligence language provides is that a co-owner is responsible for costs or damages to the association which result from negligent damage to or misuse of the common elements. All of that language just means that if we cannot show that an owner was negligent in causing the damage, then we can't force that cost upon them. It is something where we often see associations, asking, can we charge this back? And we have to ask, well, what caused the damage? And then analyze that and determine, one, whether the documents include that negligence requirement, and also, was the owner negligent in causing that damage? When you have to even go through that portion of the process, even when you can charge those costs back to the owner, you've just had to incur costs by involving legal counsel, investigating an issue, and it's just more expensive for the association, regardless of who ends up paying for that overall expense. So what is negligence? Negligence is when someone has a legal duty, they fail that duty, and it causes damages. So the difficulty here is, one, establishing the duty. It's got to be an item that the owner is responsible for, that they have failed in some way to discharge that responsibility, and that it caused damages. Just because an owner is responsible for something doesn't necessarily mean that the damages resulting from that item would be the result of negligence, though. Oftentimes an owner will or won't do something that might not just make sense to the average person, but it also doesn't equate to negligence. So, for example, a lack of maintenance does not necessarily constitute negligence unless there's some evidence that the owner was on notice of that obligation and then failed to perform the required maintenance. Something like, and this goes to the next slide as well, but refrigerator drain lines or AC drain lines, those are items that need some routine maintenance to ensure that they don't get clogged and backed up and cause a slow leak. The reality is that we understand that, but not everybody does. And really the average person probably has never looked at their AC drain line or their refrigerator water supply line. Those things fail over time, get clogged, cause damage, and especially with AC drain lines and with water supply lines for refrigerators, they're usually located in a relatively inaccessible location and they go unnoticed for a long time. Countless times we've seen the report from an association that the first floor owner all of a sudden noticed a gigantic water stain on their ceiling. And only after it was investigated was it determined, well, yeah, that's coming from the AC condenser in the unit above you because their condensation line has been clogged and it's likely been leaking for 2 years. It was such a slow leak that it took a very long time to leak into and cause damage to the lower unit and to the common elements. The problem with those two examples, as pointed out in this slide, is these items fail, but it doesn't equate to the owner's negligence. Using water heaters as the example, a water heater looks perfectly fine until it doesn't. They fail and they fail suddenly. And when they do fail, a lot of water leaks out and causes a pretty significant amount of damage. But just because that item failed does not, again, equate to negligence on the part of that owner. When you've got that negligence language and that requirement to prove negligence, but you can't, even though it's an item that the co-owner is responsible for and that caused damage, the association is left with having to pay for all of that. And of course, that comes out of the pockets of every other owner, even those who have properly maintained their own water heaters, washing machines, and all of those other items.
You know what, Evan? Sorry to interrupt you here. Jody has a hand raised. Jody, I'll allow you to unmute yourself there.
I was just curious about the overflowing toilets, sinks, and bathtubs. You know, if somebody's letting their water run, why is that not considered a failure on the co-owner?
Well, yeah, so that's a great question and a point that often comes up. Using the example of a toilet that is constantly running. Oftentimes they run and they're very quiet. Unless you're really looking for and know what you're looking for, you might not even notice that the toilet is running excessively. But realistically, just because that item has failed and it is causing damage, that again doesn't equate to negligence. And in order for that cost to be charged back to the owner, when you have this negligence language, you must be able to establish that it was negligent damage on the part of that owner or their guests or invitees.
And Evan, I think, you know, proving it is always a challenge, right? Okay, which is, you know, yeah, we can suspect, okay, that the cone or the resident knew that the toilet was clogged, but they just kept flushing it and that's how it overflowed, right? Okay. But when you ask them, they're going to say, no, it just suddenly happened. I didn't know how it happened. I know it's shocking that some residents may be dishonest about that, but it happens, obviously. And, you know, trying to prove what the origin of the loss was can be difficult.
And just to follow up on that, it's especially true in attached condominiums where the sanitary sewer line that's leading out of the building may service multiple different units. So even though you're able to find a clog in that sewer line and say, well, this clog happened because somebody flushed a baby wipe down the toilet or whatever else might have gone down the drain, that sanitary line now is at a point where it's serving 3 or 4 different units, and proving that it was one particular owner is difficult, if not impossible, in that sort of a situation. So the good news is there is a solution to this problem. And that solution is to eliminate the reference to negligence entirely. It makes it what I like to sort of refer to as a no-fault situation. If you are responsible for the item and that item causes damage, you are responsible for the damages for that item, at least to the extent that they're not covered by insurance. So one of the costs that an association incurs, even when it is an insurable loss situation, is the insurance deductible. By removing that negligence language, again, being able to assign those costs back to the individual owner, you can make that co-owner pay for the association's insurance deductible. So it makes it kind of a zero sum for the association, where all out-of-pocket expenses are paid by the responsible co-owner. And it also avoids all of the time and the money spent in determining and arguing about whether there is negligence involved. Your toilet overflowed, your toilet caused damage, you are responsible for the costs for that damage. Now, an important note and distinction here is that the responsibility for the costs is not the same as the responsibility for performing the work. So an amendment to remove that negligence reference is again a material amendment and does require 2/3 of all of the owners entitled to vote, though removing the negligence requirement does not require a mortgagee vote. Again, those amendment approval requirements are in the context of condominiums. Subdivisions are different, and often this negligence issue is not even going to be relevant. Tony, I see you've got a question.
Yeah,
Yeah, hi, Tony. Yeah, go ahead.
here's my question. Mold, and everybody laughs, right? What do you do in a situation where you can't get inside a unit to notice that there's mold growing in an unfinished basement? The co-owner was aware of.
Whoops. Let me see if we can get Tony back here. Oh, sorry, Tony. We might have had a little bit of difficulty.
Okay.
Are you back with us?
Yeah, I think so. Does that work?
All right, there you are. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Okay, so situation where there's mold growing on the rafters and the joists in the basement, in an unfinished basement of a condo unit. The co-owner's aware that there's a moisture issue in the basement. They said they were going to put dehumidifiers in and never did anything about it. When the inspection was done for the sale of the unit, significant mold was found. And the question is, who pays for it? Who pays for the remediation? Since my uninformed and not legal opinion is that since the co-owner knew about it and did not inform the association, so anything could have been done in a timely fashion, is that considered enough negligence to put the nickel on their table for the repairs?
You know, Tony, you've asked a multi-layered question. Let me try to get to the heart of it. Possibly, right? Okay. And the reason being is, I mean, a lot goes into that. And I would say this, one of the things that we didn't point out as part of the, expressly point out as part of the changes that we would make to the negligence language that Evan's been discussing is adding a requirement of reporting known damages to the association, okay? Which helps emphasize that if there is something that is only visible from the interior of your unit that the association doing a walkthrough is never going to notice, you need to report that to the association so that the association can effectively manage the loss, okay? In the situation that you've described, okay, if there was no drop ceiling in the basement and water is visible on the joists and there's clearly mold that anyone going down in the basement would have realized, yeah, potentially, I think we might be able to get there. But it's hard for me to definitively say yes, because there's a lot of factors that go into that question.
Such as?
Well, I mean, let me just throw this out there, okay? I have had co-owners say in those scenarios, I don't go in my basement. I don't go down there. Okay, there's no need for me to be down there. How would I know that it was leaking and the loss was coming from a common element that was the association's responsibility to begin with? Okay, so I mean, that may sound like an extreme example, but you'd be surprised about how many people actually make that argument. So I think, what you're describing really has to be, looked at on a case-by-case basis. But I think from a general sense, okay, having an obligation on co-owners to report known damages is very important. And even without that language, might you be able to get there? Potentially.
Okay, thank you.
I think what Jeff pointed out right there or alluded to is really an important consideration here, and it's clarify your documents so that these arguments are less available. The more there is argument, the more it will cost to get to the bottom and the solution to any given situation. And by making it much more simple to address these situations, you avoid those kind of other costs that are intertwined with the actual damage issue, which is really what needs to be fixed. It also kind of ties right into this incidental damage language, where a typical incidental damage provision reads along the lines of the association shall be responsible for the reconstruction, repair, and maintenance of the common elements and any incidental damage to a unit caused by such common elements or the reconstruction, repair, or maintenance thereof. So what does this mean? It generally is going to apply when a common element or the maintenance, repair, or replacement of that common element causes damage to personal property or fixtures or something else within a unit. Now, this might sound problematic on its face, and it is. An example of why it is so problematic is because the association with this sort of provision can become responsible for items that aren't common elements, that the association would not typically be responsible for, and that the association doesn't even know existed. There's a beautiful painting there that's clearly been water damaged. The owner of the unit where that painting was put up on the wall knew that they had this priceless piece of art. They could insure for that. They could protect themselves and their investment in that painting. But the association that doesn't even know that it exists can't protect the association from it, can't insure against things that they don't know exists. So the incidental damage language is really problematic because it creates liability, unknown liability for an association that is difficult, if not impossible, to protect against. Another portion of this is that it ties in with your insurance responsibilities. So if you've got that single entity insurance coverage that we were talking about before, it's not dependent upon whether the co-owner's insurance provides coverage or not. If you have that incidental damage language, the association becomes responsible for that expense, regardless of whether there's an associate or co-owner insurance coverage for that item. Tony, you asked about basements, although your example was unfinished basements, but same thing applies for finished basements. Does incidental damage mean that an association becomes responsible for basement finishes? And the answer is sort of. It'll always depend upon the situation involved, how the damage was caused, and some other factors. But certainly that incidental damage language can mean that an association becomes responsible for finishes and other items that are otherwise located in a unit basement. Again, items the association may not know exists, can't really adequately protect against or insure. So it's just another example of potential liability for an association that is relatively easily avoidable through an amendment to your governing documents.
And to put a bow on it, it's not necessarily dependent on the association failing to uphold its responsibilities. Sometimes roofs leak, okay, even though we haven't hit the 20 or 25 year tail end of the lifespan of the roof. It happens, okay? And if you have incidental damage language in your bylaws, you're responsible from the damages to the unit that flow from that water leak, even though you weren't prepared or didn't ever expect that the roof to leak was going to leak in the first place.
A very good point, Jeff. Thanks. So what is the solution for a governing document that has this incidental damage language? Well, similarly to the negligence language, eliminate it entirely. And what you need to do is amend your documents so that rather than the association being responsible for incidental damage, the responsibilities are generally tied to the insurance obligations. So if a party is responsible for insuring that item, they'll also be responsible for that item regardless of the cause or nature of the damage. An amendment that removes this incidental damage language is another example of a material amendment, which under the act has to be approved by 2/3 of all eligible co-owners. It is also an example of an amendment that does not require mortgagee approval. So it's something to discuss with your association council. Really removing the incidental damage language is certainly beneficial, but it should, in my opinion, be tied in with some of these other changes. Even if you're not going to change the day-to-day responsibilities, you might tie together the incidental damage and removal of negligence language into one amendment, or tie those two along with an insurance change all into one amendment. Which again, the whole purpose of these are to protect the association's finances. And by protecting the association's finances, you're protecting each individual's finances and individual budgets. We're going to shift gears a little bit into some provisions in governing documents that enable the association to collect or charge owners for costs that are incurred because of that owner. Titled this section collection provisions. So there are certain protections that are provided for by the Condominium Act, things like the automatic recovery of attorney's fees and costs without having to obtain a judgment in the context of collecting delinquent assessments. Now, there's different language that can be incorporated into your bylaws, which allows the association to automatically assess costs of enforcement without having to obtain a judgment. That is something that we do see historically in condominium documents, but the vast majority of older documents require the association to obtain a judgment before those fees and costs for enforcing the documents can be assessed back to that individual owner. Lien authority, that's what is protected by the association's lien. In the condominium context, it includes both assessments as well as what I'll refer to as costs of collection, late fees, fines levied for delinquencies, attorney's fees, things of that nature. Some of the other categories of items that your documents might fail to address, but we would encourage associations to incorporate so that it's very clear that an owner is responsible for these charges or these costs that the association would incur, would be things like late charges and interest. Another provision that we often see in condominium documents, occasionally it comes up in subdivision documents, but we would encourage associations considering an amendment to add this provision into their bylaws, is the ability to accelerate assessments for those owners who are delinquent. So say you're a condominium association, you have monthly assessments, or an owner chooses or fails to pay the first 2 or 3 months worth of assessments for the year. And when they're sent notice about that, they ignore that notice. The ability to accelerate the installments allows the association to notify the owner that because of their delinquency, not only are they responsible for those first 2 or 3 months of assessments, but the entire rest of the year's worth of assessments are immediately due and payable. It's just a very effective enforcement mechanism for an association to utilize to ensure timely payment of assessments to the association. Another example is the application of payment language. This language, when it's present in your documents, will clarify that when an owner is delinquent and they make a payment, that payment goes first to the costs of collection and then to late fees and lastly to assessments that are still remaining owing. The purpose of this language is to make it very clear that when you're delinquent and you make payments, you're paying the cost the association incurs before you ever even get to paying off your delinquency. And that's helpful because there remains an assessment balance no matter what amounts you pay until you've paid that full amount 100% to the association. Another provision that can be included in bylaws, and which we typically include in new documents that we're drafting or in amendments that we're drafting for existing clients, is that a delinquent co-owner is not eligible to run for or serve on the board of directors. A kind of counterpart provision that we also add is that if a director is already elected and serving and then becomes delinquent, we can make an automatic removal so that that director has a specific period of time in which to resolve their delinquency. And if they fail to do that, then they're automatically removed from the board. The next provision is something that's fairly common, even in older condominium documents, but certainly something that you want to see. And it's the suspension of voting rights or the right to use the general common elements. Very simple and straightforward. If an owner is delinquent, they're not eligible to vote and they're not eligible to use the common elements. Now, that does not mean they're not eligible to travel across, for example, the common element roads to get to their unit, but it does mean that the association can prevent them from utilizing recreational facilities or a park that might be a part of your community. The last provision here to be discussed is the inclusion of language which allows the association to assess costs that are incurred because of a co-owner's bankruptcy back to that co-owner. Even a non-delinquent co-owner who files bankruptcy and addresses the association in their plan, the association is going to incur some amount of costs in working with association counsel, dealing with that bankruptcy, monitoring it, ensuring payments are timely, corresponding with the bankruptcy attorney or the bankruptcy trustee. And all of those costs are only incurred because that owner ended up filing bankruptcy. So it's not fair to all of the rest of the owners to bear that cost. So by providing this language, you're able to assess those charges back to the delinquent, and in this instance, co-owner who has filed bankruptcy. Sticking with collections, we recommend associations adopt a collections policy. It helps to provide a clear timeline for your members to know if I'm delinquent, what's going to happen to me. It also helps to avoid allegations of discrimination or unequal treatment between various delinquent owners, or an owner saying, well, my neighbor was 2 months delinquent and they didn't get a letter from the attorney, but you've sent me a letter. Well, if you adopt a collection policy, it'll put them on notice of the anticipated timeframes for various actions to be taken. And so long as the association is staying within that policy and within those timeframes, all of those arguments about unequal treatment or discrimination, the board can just point right to this policy and say, that's just not accurate. Here is the policy. We followed this policy and we always follow this policy when it comes to a delinquency. The other advantage of adopting a policy like this is that it's not part of the rest of your governing documents. Us as attorneys who specialize in this area, we can tell you exactly where to look in most condominium documents to find anything about assessments, collections, delinquencies, and the association's rights and remedies. Most owners are not that familiar with condominium documents. And so if you've provided them with a 1 or 2 page policy that identifies how the association handles delinquencies, it makes it much more likely that they'll actually read it and hopefully even understand it and know what is coming if they become delinquent.
And tagging out along with that, a collection policy can do a couple things. One of which is include that application of payment language that Evan talked about on the prior slide, where if you don't have that in your bylaws, we'll put that in the collection policy so it's clear how payments are being applied in the event that the co-owner is delinquent. Another area, late fees, right? Okay, so if your late fee is not specifically provided for in the bylaws and it can be changed by rule or it's silent in the bylaws, then the board can adopt that late fee as a reasonable approximation of the administrative costs that are arising out of the delinquency. And that can be altered to kind of keep up with, keep up with inflation and general expenses that you or your management team may be incurring as a result of delinquency. So, I mean, there's a lot of great value that can be provided by having a collection policy, even if you don't have a lot of collection accounts right now.
Great points, Jeff. Mark, I'm going to push this back over to you so you can kind of administer the question and answer portion, and Jeff and I will jump in and answer those.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Evan, and thank you, Jeff.
Sure.
I'm sure we all appreciate your experience and expertise, and hopefully we all have a better idea about how our bylaw provisions impact our bottom lines. And of course, there's many other reasons to amend your governing documents. But we wanted to focus here on those high profile items that really impact your bottom line, like we say. So yeah, we do have plenty of questions already here in the queue, and in fact, let's see, Jody has her hand up here. I'll go ahead and.
Hey, Mark, forgive me,
yes.
before we get there, I pulled up the Q&A spot.
Oh, yeah.
That, so we've got the chat, we've got Q&A, we've got questions coming from everywhere. So I might go to those Q&A ones first before we get to some other folks. So
go for it.
April Pecora, question about if we send notices regarding checking for leaks from hot water tanks, AC, and humidifiers because it happens often, can we use the negligence clause for damages? And I think, yeah, there's a probability of being able to do that. And let me give you an example, real world example that happened in one of my communities where, hot water tanks were basically put in all about the same time. And there was a propensity for them to fail earlier than expected. So the association sent out a letter to everybody in the community saying, hey, we've seen a couple of hot water tanks leak already. You better, actively monitor it and consider replacing it because of these early failures. And then wouldn't you know it, somebody didn't do that. And there was a subsequent hot water tank loss. There was a very good argument that we used in that case to suggest that the co-owner was responsible for the costs arising out of that situation.
Give another example, familiar with it was a high-rise development where all of the units were provided with washers and dryers from the developer. But the washer, specifically the washer that was being provided, years down the line, there was a recall and it was known that they had a leak issue. Wouldn't be apparent just based on a casual inspection, but these washers were all failing and causing significant amounts of damage. So that association sent a notice to all owners, letting them know of this issue, the likelihood of damage that would result from the failure of that washer, and effectively demanding that owners take the action to replace it or face the consequences of being responsible for any damages that resulted.
Terrific. Yes, thanks for that excellent question. We appreciate it. And let's see, unless there's any others that you specifically wanted to jump on, fellas. Let's see, I'll go ahead and ask Jody to unmute here. Hi, Jody.
Thank you. Hi there. I had a question on slide 19 about the application of payments and wondering if there's a generalized answer on how you create that ledger. And I think Evan's probably familiar with why I'm asking this question. We have several co-owners who are delinquent, but we've only assessed dues. We do have a late payment charge that in our documents, in our master deed, but we haven't included that, and we haven't included any attorney fees. And wondering if our ledger should be reflecting those.
So simple answer is yes, the ledger should be reflecting all of the costs, especially those costs related to collections that apply to a specific unit. I am very familiar with the couple of files that you're talking about, and I think it would probably be best if we talked about it after this seminar.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Jim. Hey, Mark, there was another question, the Q&A that I wanted to get to, which is a good one from Hannah.
Sure.
Does an association have the right to say they require payments to be ACH rather than via check? And our general answer is no. Okay. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, first of all, you're wading into potential discrimination territory. Okay. If you say that only payments are acceptable by ACH and could be by for a variety of reasons, some of which may involve, disparate impact on certain protected classes. Okay, so better to stay away from that demand from a discrimination side. And also the reality is, am I going to go to a judge and say, hey, we're foreclosing on somebody because they wanted to write a check, but the association would only accept ACH? That is not a good look, okay? And that's not, I think, a smart business decision. I get it's easier to deal with, and from an accounting perspective, I'm sure it's far more efficient for the association. But I am highly reluctant to suggest that you can just demand ACH payments for your community.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff. And thanks for yet another good question. Yes. And Tony also is asking if we could talk about fines for violations some more. Would it be, should they be in the bylaws or in a policy outside the bylaws so they can be easily changed?
So to start, you're going to need to look at your existing bylaws to see whether there are specific fines that are identified there. If there are, then you need to look to the language and see whether the board has the right to modify those fines by rule. If there are specific fine amounts stated in the bylaws and the board does not have the right specified right there to modify those fines by rule, then you'd need to be looking to an amendment. Beyond that, though, the many documents do permit the board to adopt or modify fines by rule. And that is really what we ultimately encourage. Even if a specific fine schedule is stated in the bylaws, it is beneficial for the board to have that ability to change it by rule so that you don't have to repeatedly amend your documents as the value of money changes over the years. If you've got the board right to modify the fine amounts, then 10 years from now, when say a $50 fine is not encouraging compliance with the documents, well, then the board could consider upping it to 100 or 150 or whatever other reasonable amount at that time actually motivates compliance with the documents.
Terrific. Thank you, Evan. And let's see, we have probably time for a couple more questions here. There were some that were typed earlier in the presentation. Let's see, April asked, for the limited common element definitions that can't be changed without 100% approval, what if there is no definition? For example, a patio may be listed or defined. No patio is listed or defined. It just refers to porches, but they don't have porches and only patios. Does that still need 100% approval?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, as Evan and I can probably attest to, there is a lot of inconsistencies that can develop between the recorded plans for a condominium project, okay, and the master deed itself, okay? And so for whatever reason, sometimes I wonder, was the developer actually talking to their engineer who developed the plans for the community? Because things are missing, the developer put in stuff that was never shown on the plans. And so resolving those inconsistencies can be a challenge. Now, I would say this, if there is something referenced as a limited common element in the master deed that does not exist, okay, I feel comfortable in removing it from an amendment that we make to the master deed, okay? So that's an easy one. I think it really kind of depends on a case-by-case basis how you handle it with respect to other things, because, a common thing is the master deed identifies a patio, but on the plans, it's shown as a terrace, right? Okay, but everybody in the community calls it a patio. How do you reconcile that discrepancy? So I think we need to look at it case-by-case basis as you're talking through the amendment process.
Great, thanks, Jeff. And let's see, I think we have time for one more. I see some others existing out there remaining, but we have to close it off due to time here. We will get you an answer to your questions by email if we can't answer them live here. David asked, shouldn't the co-owner, regarding the insurance claims, shouldn't the co-owner first file a claim on their co-owner's insurance policy first before the association gets involved?
So, Jeff, unless you wanted to jump in and take this, whether or not a claim gets filed is really dependent upon the insurance responsibilities stated in the bylaws. Under the Condominium Act, there is no obligation for owners to maintain insurance. It is solely based on what your bylaws provide. And although the reality may be that many owners or all of your owners do carry some sort of homeowners insurance or some sort of liability coverage, if the documents don't require them to maintain that coverage and the association is required to maintain coverage, then it's incumbent upon the association to consider at least filing an insurance claim. The other thing is, that explanation I just brought up kind of distinguishes between the association and the owners. But keep in mind, the owners are members of and really make up the association. They are paying into that. They're paying a portion of the association's insurance premiums. They're entitled to that coverage that the association is obligated to maintain. So the simple answer to your question is, it depends on what your bylaws state. The more likely scenario is we can't require an owner to file a claim and seek coverage under their policy unless there is a requirement on that owner to maintain insurance under your documents.
And I want to add two things to that point, because it's a really good question, and Evan's done a very good job explaining it, which in most documents that have that single entity insurance policy that we were suggesting you might want to consider getting away from, there in the reconstruction and repair section of the bylaws, there is generally language that basically says, hey, if there is damage to interior walls or standard fixtures, equipment, and trim inside a unit that's covered by the insurance held by the association, then the responsibility for reconstruction and repair shall be borne by the association. So there's this idea that's built in a lot of single entity documents that the association's insurance is primary, even when you're talking about damages to the interior of the unit. And I think for many years, a lot of individual co-owner insurance companies just thought, well, if there's damage to the interior of the unit, it's ours, we're insuring it, okay? And they would provide coverage. Those days are over, okay? You are seeing a sea change in how individual HO6 co-owner insurance companies evaluate losses. And if they see single entity insurance and the language that I just described, they're coming back to associations and managers and saying, nope, it's not us to deal with this. You guys are primary for filing a claim.
That's an example of getting the insurance companies to fight with each other in a way that we don't want them to fight with each other. We want them to fight over who covers it, not whether it's covered. And that situation you just explained is a situation where somebody's getting denied coverage, and we don't like that.
Excellent. Thank you, gentlemen. And thank you all for these excellent questions. We really do appreciate it because your contributions here really add a lot of value to our time together here. We appreciate it. So to wrap up, please keep your eyes on your email for a follow-up survey about our presentation today. We would highly appreciate your feedback, as it allows us to ensure that we're providing useful information to you. And also, some of you have asked about this. We have recorded the presentation today, and I'll include a link to it in that same email. And you can feel free to share it. We'd like to continue the conversation with you, so please be sure to follow us on social media and connect with us through our email newsletter. And you can sign up for that at our website at meglawpllc.com. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll sign off here. Have a great day.